here. My name is Terry Diamond, and this series, as you well know if you've been here before, is brought to you by a partnership between Kenai Soil and Water Conservation District and UAF Cooperative Extension, as well as the Agribility Program that supports our Alaska growers. This is a 7-part series, or has been a 7-part series. There's 2 more series left after tonight. And, you know, the point is just to get as much out of your land as you can and improve our local food security, which we've all had a feel for lately. So whether you're a home gardener or a small farm or interested in land development, hopefully you'll find something within these series to help you. I'm going to introduce Deshauna York. She's the Agribility Director for UAF Cooperative Extension, and she's located in the wonderful city of Anchorage. She assists clients with finding resources they need within our university in all kinds of topics, also has all kinds of publications to help you out if you need it. And she also partners with other organizations to create educational opportunities and projects on a statewide basis. So that being said, I am going to turn it over to Deshauna, and she will introduce our speakers for this evening.
Thank you, Terry, and welcome back to all those who've been with us over the last several weeks. And hopefully you're in the right place. If you haven't joined us until tonight, the topic for this evening is benefits and the use of cover crops in Alaskan soils. So we are honored tonight to have 3 amazing individuals share their knowledge and expertise with us. And they are Tracy Robillard with NRCS, Jeff Smeenk, and Bryce Wrigley. We're going to start out this evening. I'm going to do a little bit of intro for each of them, and then we will, as we have done in the past, go ahead and start with Tracy speaking from NRCS a little bit. Then we'll roll into Jeff and then Bryce this evening. So really quick to start out, Tracy Robillard is the Public Affairs Specialist for the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service in Palmer, Alaska. She specializes in internal and external communications that provide information, education, and outreach to private landowners, conservation partners, news media, and the public about NRCS conservation programs and principles. Tracy began her career with NRCS in 2014 in Portland, Oregon, and then moved to Alaska in 2020. Before working for NRCS, she was a public affairs specialist with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Savannah, Georgia. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Mass Communications with a minor in music from the University of West Georgia in her hometown of, Carrollton, Georgia. Tracy is passionate about conservation, soil health, and outdoor recreation. She and her husband Kyle live in Palmer with their dog Scout and 2 cats, Rick and Ramsey. So give a little wave there, Tracy. I apologize for my voice being a bit raspy tonight. So then we'll hear from Jeff Smeenk. He's been working in agriculture since 1985 after completing his BS in agronomy. From there, he went on to graduate work in plant pathology and later sustainable agriculture. As part of his preparation for his comprehensive exam, Jeff became a certified agronomist. After grad school, he moved to Alaska to become the UAF CES Extension Specialist for Commercial Agriculture. After leaving UAF, Jeff has been working for the Alaska Association of Conservation Districts, where he manages the Palmer District, conducts agricultural demonstration projects in the Mat-Su region, and provides statewide agricultural consulting. And then lastly, we will hear from Bryce Wrigley, who has farmed in Delta Junction since 1983 and is committed to developing a sustainable local food system in Alaska. His commitment pushed him to shift to a no-tillage farming system, and most recently, they have incorporated cover crops to improve the soil on their Delta Junction farm. In 2011, they founded Alaska Flour Company to increase Alaska's food security. Alaska Flour Company's product line has grown to include over a dozen products, all made from sunshine hulless barley developed at UAF. Bryce and his family are deeply committed to expanding agriculture in Alaska as the best way to strengthen our food security. They believe that Alaska has several advantages for growing healthy food, including very low disease clean soil and water, and long sunlight hours during the growing season. And with that, we are pleased to have all of you with us this evening. And Tracy, if you'd like to start us off, we look forward to hearing from all of you.
Sure thing. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in today. My name is Tracy Robillard. I'm with the NRCS, that's the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I'm so proud to be here today to talk about our services for landowners across Alaska for soil health. So NRCS, our agency actually started with the Dust Bowl during the Great Depression in the 30s with massive amounts of soil erosion that took place in the Great Plains, huge dust storms. And that is actually when our agency was founded as the Soil Conservation Service. And so over time, the agency has adapted over the years to take on other conservation projects beyond the soil. So we got our name NRCS in the 90s. And so I wanted to just briefly mention a couple of things that we're doing here in Alaska with private landowners and our conservation partners to promote soil health and cover crops. I know that's our topic today. And so anything, if you've heard of soil health in other parts of the lower 48, you hear about pioneers in the soil health movement in the Midwest, like Gabe Brown and others who are doing phenomenal things with no-till and cover crops. And there's so much good information out there, especially on YouTube and other sites about what these producers are doing. And they're able to take no-till and cover crops and crop rotations and some of these soil conservation practices and really make them work and make them profitable and build up healthy soils. So then you take those same concepts to Alaska and holy moly, it looks very different up here. And so that is where NRCS comes in, because we want to figure out with the help of our landowners and our conservation partners, figure out how can we tweak those soil health principles and practices that are successful in other parts of the country? How do we tweak that and make it work here in our unique growing conditions for our producers? So one of the ways we're doing that is we're funding several cover crop trials across the state. And both of our other speakers today are participants in those trials. And so we've got 7 different trials going on with our conservation districts in Homer, Kenai, Palmer, out in Copper River, Fairbanks, Delta. And so we're looking at what varieties of cover crops will work and when is the best time to terminate or to plant. I'm sorry, when is the best time to plant? We have a second trial that's going on here in Palmer with Alaska Pacific University that is looking at termination methods for cover crops. And that is also looking at cover crops on a smaller scale. And then we have a larger scale trial going on at the Palmer Plant Materials Center. And that has been going on for the last 6 years. We've got 4 more years left in it. And that's looking at no-till, impacts of no-till, and in conjunction with cover crops. So there's lots of exciting things going on across the state to figure out what's going to work here. And so with that in mind, if you're working with a conservation district, or if you're just interested in trying some of these techniques on your property, I'd highly encourage you to reach out to NRCS. I'll put my contact information in the chat here, as well as our state soil scientist, Cory. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here tonight, but he is a wealth of knowledge as well. And NRCS also provides, in addition to doing these trials, we also provide financial assistance directly to growers. If you're interested in trying no-till or doing cover crops, maybe you want to start on a small scale and build up, which is what we'd recommend doing. We offer financial incentives that can help you offset some of that financial risk that you might be taking on. and help you dial in a recipe for your cover crop mix and find out what's going to work on your soils. So definitely reach out to Cory, to myself, to your local NRCS office. And we will have another presentation in this workshop series on March 1st. And that presentation will feature my colleague, Amanda Crow, who can tell you more about our various financial assistance programs and how you can apply for those. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I will turn it over to our next speaker.
Thank you, Tracy. I don't see that if anyone has any questions for Tracy right off, go ahead and put those in the chat. Otherwise, we can move on, and we will have questions here a bit later as well. May I let a few other people in? All right.
I did see a comment about buckwheat that
Yes.
just up.
Sure. Did you have a comment on that? There was some questions about suggestions, and I thought we could, well, also ask that a little bit later, but go ahead, Tracy, if you have a comment.
Sure thing. No, I'm sure Jeff's going to cover that as Mr. Agronomist. So I know buckwheat was one of the species in our trial for sure. So
what's the question? I don't see it here on my screen.
It's a comment. Says the individual says tried buckwheat to cool to germinate for early or late. Clover worked, but attracted many rabbits. Tried also. So they were talking about using barley grass and asked if anyone had suggestions for cover crops. But I think you're about to get into that, so we can also come back to that a little bit later. All right, Jeff, take it away.
So how do I control the slides? Just say next.
Yes,
Yep.
that is correct.
I'm Jeff Smeenk. I'm an agronomist with AACD. And next slide, pretty please. So first off, what is a cover crop? The textbook definition is a cover crop is a crop that provides cover to the soil. Duh, that's in its name. To an agronomist, a cover crop is an actively managed crop that is grown to support the secondary farm needs rather than being the primary crop grown in the field. So if you put out red clover in a perennial mix and you're going to bale that as hay, that's hay. That's not a cover crop. But if you put out red clover and you grow it as an annual for its nitrogen fixing or soil benefits, then it's a cover crop. And by the way, weedy fallow is not considered a managed cover crop. It's just a mess out in your field. So it's the cover crops is about the management, not about the individual species. Next, please. So when I poll the growers in the Palmer area about cover crops, they tell me what's most important to them is they want to minimize the off-season erosion, both wind and water erosion. They want to decrease their fertilizer bill, and they want to control weeds. Those are the most important pieces to the farmers. The valley is known for its wind, so you can, in the bottom right picture, you can see the Matanuska River on a good blowing day. That's all silt that's going to be blowing around. Unfortunately, if our fields are uncovered, those could also be our fields. On the left, that's a rill in a field that has been tilled in the fall, but you can see that in the springtime, the moving water on top of frozen ground is moving soil around. So even though those rills are quite small, I've seen many fields here where they may be almost 10 inches deep and sometimes 1,000 or 2,000 foot long. Next slide, please. So in addition to the ones the farmers are concerned about, cover crops also improve the soil physical characteristics by increasing the organic matter. So this results in better soil infiltration. So water that rains onto the field goes into the soil quicker. It increases the soil aggregation. These are the clumps that are so important for root channeling. And it increases the water holding capacity, the ability of soil to hold on to rain and not leach it out. And organic cover crops also decrease the bulk density of the soil. You can see in those cubes in the bottom left picture, the root channels and other things that allow air to go through and loosen up the soil a bit. Next, please. Cover crops also provide additional field and or wildlife habitat. So it increases the wildlife feed and cover. You can see the cranes feeding on our plots in the bottom picture. It's not always desired habitat, but it does help the cranes out. Bonus livestock grazing in the lower 48, that's quite a good practice where a cover crop will be grazed by a beef operation. Here, one of the clients that I work with, she says she gets an extra 2 weeks of grazing when she opens up the cover crop fields before she has to put her livestock on hay. So it's 2 weeks of free grazing. And of course, it's a pollinator food source. North America has a really big pollinator problem. So the more we can help our bees and other pollinators, the better it is. Next, please. Cover crops also enhance the soil food web. It increases nutrient cycling through the mineralization of organic matter. That's a fancy way of saying the microbes are able to take the organic matter in the soil and break it down and provide the nutrients for the crop to take up. Cover crops increases the nutrient supply. You can get both nitrogen from legumes and phosphorus from the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. And the microbes decrease diseases by increasing the microbial predators. Anytime you have a lot of any kind of microorganisms around, you're going to have the predators, and they'll be eating the good things and the bad things. So it helps out the diseases that way. Next, please. And cover crops decrease the nutrient leaching and lowers the fertilizer needs. So it captures onto the nutrients so that when you have a rain or an irrigation event, that water doesn't wash the nutrients away from the root zone. And it also, the residue will break down in the next year to release more of the nutrients, and the root channels that the cover crops leave allow the next crop to explore the soil better. Next, please. So the challenges to cover crops in Alaska, well, in Mat-Su especially, land is exceptionally expensive, so farmers are reluctant to just leave it idle. In the Mat-Su area, $25,000 an acre, so we have a lot of development pressure, so prime vegetable land should be kept busy. And there's also a very short growing season, so you don't have the opportunities as we would in the lower 48 to double crop. Our soil thaws in early May in South Central, late May in the interior, and then we'll have a killing frost many times mid-September in South Central, and sometimes as early as late August in the interior. So we have a very short window, and that often doesn't allow a cover crop to follow up an existing crop or the other way around. Next, please. It's also a chicken and egg issue. No one does it, so there's no market for the equipment or services. And since there's no equipment to make it easy, we don't have farmers really using a lot of cover crops. So to try to break that, I'm making an air seeder for a tractor just to see if we can find a custom cover crop seeding market. Next, please. Also, there are IPM concerns. Some of our major crops in the valley especially are the brassicas. So the growers have a reluctance of using a brassica cover crop in a vegetable production because you'd have the same diseases that could go from the cover crop to the main crop. And also barley as a is a potential alternate host of sclerotinia in potatoes. So that rules out some of our very productive cover crops in the vegetable operations of the South Central area. We also have weed issues. There are very few herbicides that are registered for Alaska vegetables, so we can't have a cover crop that would get out of control. Cover crops have the potential to import weeds into the weed seeds into the mix, and there's also the potential for existing weeds to go to seed because you're allowing the cover crop to grow, so the weeds also grow. And there's also the potential for a cover crop to become a weed. So we're very careful about what materials we would use for the cover crop. Next, please. It's also a fairly recent practice to Alaska, so there's not a whole lot of information about it. In the lower 48, the calculators aren't calibrated for our unique season. By a number of cover crop vendors in the lower 48 have really neat calculators that you say what you're trying to control and what your parameters are, and they'll recommend seed mixes for you. We have no evidence that they'll work here, so we're still trying to figure out how to do it ourselves. There's also minimal baseline information on cover crop performance. We have no documentation in Alaska of the soil health benefits. We're just trusting everybody in the lower 48. And fundamentally, there's no success stories to show other growers that it works here in Alaska. So growers simply don't know if it's a profitable practice in Alaska. Next, please. As Tracy mentioned, one of the NRCS sponsored projects is the Plant Materials Center's Soil Health Initiative. And they're going with a number of mixes: Timothy, alfalfa, oat pea buckwheat radish, oat pea buckwheat radish, and I can't see what's behind that. Rye and alfalfa, thank you. And they're running these for 1, 2, and 3 years of cover crop rotation, and then putting in potatoes. So they want to determine the impact of the cover crop on the potato yields and how they impact the various soil health measures. And as Tracy mentioned, they've got a number of years more to go with that. Next, please. Another project that NRCS has sponsored is the Palmer Conservation District put in an oat pea buckwheat radish mix, and we planted it weekly from May until it was terminated by the frost. So you can see in the picture, I took this picture in mid-September, and the plot closest to us is 1 week old, then 2 weeks old, all the way out to next to the pickup truck where the cover crop was 14 weeks old. And then we were going to measure, or we measured height, biomass, percent cover, density, nutrient status. And what we found was in the year that we planted it, we really didn't see any changes to the soil. And we think that's because the cover crop was never incorporated into the soil. So it really didn't have a chance for all that cover to be incorporated into the soil and give us the benefits. Next, please. So in that same trial, we found out that it takes 4 to 6 weeks of growth before the killing freeze to get adequate residue to minimize the erosion. So the plot on the left-hand side, that was taken in September, and that plot was strong enough, it had enough residue that by the springtime, on the right side of the picture, you can see there's adequate residue in that plot to really protect it from erosion. So in this season, the crop only had to be 4 weeks old, and then the following season was not as warm into the fall, so it took 6 weeks of growth to get that level of protection. Next, please. So one of our growers is very interested in cover crops. So we fool around a lot in the field with him. He gave me a call and said, "Hey, I'm going to till up this field this afternoon. You want to put a cover crop trial in?" So we raced out there and put oat peas right ahead of his rototiller. And we put different densities, and we sprinkled some right on top of the cabbage that he was rototilling into the field. And we found out in a September planting, the peas really didn't do anything, but the oats grew for 3 weeks before the frost hit it and killed it. We found the cabbage residue didn't hinder the oats. So where we sprinkled the oats right on top of the existing cabbage before he rototilled it in, that cover crop grew just fine. Where we had the cover crop, we had very few rills in those plots, and where we had bare soil, that's where we saw the rills. And we also saw that the residue didn't impact the spring planting. It was nothing fouled up the planters, so that was a great level of cover. So what we might try in the future is putting the air seeder on the rototiller and basically blow the seeds right into the rototiller to be incorporated, or possibly put a spinner spreader on top of the seed to keep the cost down. Next, please. Palmer wrote a SARA project to try to crimp the cover crop and then transplant lettuce into the cover crop to see if we got weed suppression. We had a couple of participating farms, an organic, a conventional, and an incubator farm. Next, please. So here you can see the incubator farm where all the plots were crimped down. So we went into fall with a fairly thick layer of residue on the surface, and the young lady on the right, we didn't get the roller crimper working. So basically she's just standing on a piece of seed channel and crimping it all by hand. Luckily, they were fairly small plots and it didn't take more than half a day to do those plots. And then we were hoping to record how much labor it would take to grow the lettuce with this residue in place. Next, please. It turns out it was a disaster. There was no weed suppression come the following spring. The weeds grew just fine in all 10 of the different cover crop treatments. But what we saw accidentally was where we had put oats down real heavy to make a walkway. That's the only place where we saw any potential for control. Next, please. So we modified the treatment. We got Sarah's permission and we took the oat straw and raked it from one area and put it double heavy in another area. So we had 3 treatments: no oat straw, the regular planting, and double oat straw. And we saw a little bit of suppression, but what the grower found out is it took longer to weed the oat straw and even much longer to weed the double straw. So although there was a little bit of suppression, it was not complete. And the grower found out this just took more time to control than the bare ground. The grower also requested that we terminate the project because she was noticing an increased level of slug pressure and didn't want to put the crop at risk. So in order to change it a little bit, we tried to plant at the incubator farm 2, 3, 4, and 6 bushels of oats on a weekly basis to see, can we catch up with cover by going with really heavy rates? And unfortunately, we ran out of oat seed and found out in early September there was a statewide lack of oat seed. So we had to terminate that project. Just couldn't buy oats if we looked for them. Next, please. So our project consultant is Michelle Giuseski at NRCS. And she said one of the problems that we're having with cover crops is we keep tilling the soil and using the cover crop. And that's when the weeds come through and really hurt us. So she's saying we have to figure out how to get no-till cover crops put in. So there are only 3 no-till drills in the state that I know of. 2 of them are too large to be considered road portable, and one of them is just too light to break through a sod. So we're trying to modify this tractor to put an cover crop, no-till cover crop planter out of it. Next, please. So part of that SEER grant is to build a very small scale no-till planter. And unfortunately, not just the pandemic, but shipping in general, we ordered these seed heads a year and a half ago, and they finally got delivered this October. So we're going to take the air seeder, which will supply the seeds into the no-till planter. So now this winter, we're going to fabricate a no-till planter so that we can see if we'll have a small scale planter for a lot of our appropriate scaled garden, market gardens. Next, please. Sarah funded this, so I please invite everybody to go to the Sarah website to see the opportunities. They're a fantastic organization to work with, and they really do want to work with farmers and growers. Next, please. So this is the cover crop trial that Tracy was talking about. We've got a 600-mile transect of the state, 23 different varieties involved in it. 6 of the sites plant early, 2 of the sites plant late. We're going to run it through the 2021 and the 2022 growing season, and we collect biomass, percent cover, and other conditions, trying to evaluate how these same crops do in all these different locations. Next, please. I see a question, where is Southeast Alaska in these trials? I'm not sure that I know of an interest in Southeastern cover crop trials. I've not heard of one yet. So if there is strong interest, please contact us. So we have at each of the locations, it's kind of use what you've got. So you can see Delta Junction's very large, air cedar, and Palmer Wausilla's rather small. Drag a chain behind it for the small seeds and drag a cultivator for the large seeds. So we terminated each of the sites so that they don't go to seed, mowing, herbicide, frost, however. Next, please. Short-term project goals determine the productivity of these 23 varieties across Alaska, introduce the practice to growers using various outreach events at each of the sites, developing the local expertise both in producing the cover crops and in collecting the data from the cover crops, and of course, evaluate the various management practices. Long-term goals is trying to build the single species results into an optimal mix. Before we know what to put into the mix, we have to see how the individual components grow. Try to make available regional appropriate recommendations, assist NRCS with their cover crop practices by fine-tuning them. And ultimately, a lot of us are very interested in making an Alaska appropriate cover crop calculator. And of course, cover crops go well beyond agriculture. Wildfire soil stabilization, mine reclamation, stormwater soil stabilization, and DOT construction projects. All of them use vegetation to control the soil. So this information would be useful for any number of reasons. Next, please. So here are the 23 different species of the small grains. We have sunshine, two-row, and odal barley, naked Athabascan and Toral oats, FX 101 and 813 triticale, burble rye, nitro and nematode control radish, turbo and purple top turnips, white gold mustard, collards, Wyoming and Austrian winter field peas, medium Kenland and Canadian mammoth red clover, buckwheat, Macan and sunflower, and I don't see who's on the bottom. Next, please. So you can see who the actual varieties of the species are. So here are each of the different species where I've averaged the 2 triticales, the 3 oats, and the barleys, and you can see quite a bit of difference at each of the locations. In general, we found out that Delta had great yields. Wasilla had some high yields in grains and the brassicas. Fairbanks had moderate yields. Homer, Kenai had similar yields. And Palmer, because it was a late planted site with a huge drought, had horrible yields. As an agronomist, we did really poorly. Next, please. So what I've done is colored the different groupings of plants. So all the blue ones are the brassicas, all the green ones are the small grains. So you can see at each of the different locations how the grains and the brassicas did, and the other brown ones are sunflower, flax, some of the other, I would almost call them an oddball group. And then on the little chart in the corner, where we have multiple varieties of the same species, those numbers are the yields for the very small plots that we did. And you can see that clover, radish, barley, and oats, those were all fairly close, but within the triticale, there were quite a bit of differences between the two varieties, and the same with field peas. There were quite big differences between those two varieties of field pea. Next, please. This one has lost its identity. I think it's Fairbanks. Red clover was a big difference, and triticale had the differences. And again, you can see where the grains and brassicas came out in the yield. Next, please. Similar pattern, but it's lost its identity. I think this might be Kenai. Next, please. Here's Wasilla's. We measured our biomass a little bit differently than the others, and I suspect that's why the Wasilla yields appear to be higher than some of the other locations, but we found huge differences in red clover and in triticale. So all these numbers are how many grams of biomass were within a square meter of area. So it's not very useful for a farmer to know grams per meter, but the relative order of the different cover crops is much more useful for us. Next one, please. Oh, here's Fairbanks, and you can see the big differences are in triticale, oats, radish, and turnip. They had quite a bit of variability between the different treatments. How large an area? We took the biomass for most of the sites on a 1 square meter area. So in that earlier picture, you saw the young lady bending over with a hedge clipper and a 1 meter transect. So we would harvest all of the yield within that area. So that's what makes these numbers obviously suspect, because we're kind of taking what we found in 1 square meter and extrapolating it over the size of a field. So that's why they're relative numbers versus absolute numbers. Next, please. And here's Palmer's. You can see our yield numbers were lower than many of the other ones. Palmer had a drought, and it wasn't until I was able to get irrigation going in each of the plots that we actually had seed germination. So it sat there for almost a week before we got an irrigation system set up. Next, please. So here's the yields of 1 square meter for each of the locations. For the red ones, those are the worst 4 of the group, and the blue ones are the best 4 of the group. Next one, please. So the pattern I see is that red clover and rye were among the 4 worst treatments at almost each of the locations. So red clover and rye were consistently among the worst yields at all locations. Next, please. And we find that mustard, oats, and barley are among the 4 best yielding at all 4 treatments. So here's the pattern that we see is across the state, red clover and rye seem to be doing poorly at all locations, but mustard, oats, and barley seem to be doing well at all locations. Next, please. So where do we go from here? Well, for soil health, we need to determine which species or mixes will build the organic matter the best and which will minimize erosion. So we're learning the individual species. Now from here, we have to take it to how do we make the mixes to do the best. For weed control, we have to determine which species or mix will best smother the weeds and accomplish our weed reduction. I'm very interested in using herbicide tolerant crops as cover crops. I'm trying to work with somebody in the lower 48 to get a bag of Roundup Ready soybeans or sugar beets so that we can put a cover crop down and then hit it with Roundup to control all the weeds and then plow the crop under. And one of the growers in the area is very interested in allelopathic cover crops. Rye specifically is known, as it breaks down, to hurt any other weed around it, very young weed seedlings. So this grower wants to know, can he manage rye to act as a natural herbicide by controlling when he plows it in? And for the logistics, we have to figure out how the cover crops will fit into our cropping system in general. And we have to develop an appropriate scale equipment to use cover crops. In the lower 48, many different conservation districts have access to a small no-till drill. Nobody here in Alaska has a small no-till drill that growers can borrow. So that's part of the logistics we have to work on. Next, please. Thanks. So leave it up to Bryce and we'll hang around for questions, pretty please.
Jeff, if you have a couple minutes, we do have a couple questions in between here.
Sure.
So a couple of other things. I put in the chat box there the link to the NRCS, a great website for what's going on around the state related to cover crops, as well as a dovetail on what you've already talked about. Were soil temperatures measured under the oat straw? Did the oat straw keep the temperatures cooler?
Soil temperature was put into each location, but we didn't specify under which treatment it should be. So I'd have to ask each of the individual districts which treatment got the temperature probe. I would expect, oh, you mean at the SARE project, the oat straw there?
Yeah.
Because that was left on the surface. We didn't measure the temperature, but we think that it was more a smothering effect that kept the weeds down than a temperature effect.
Okay.
Because by June hits around, the soil gets its temperature rather from the air quite effectively.
Okay. There was a question about crimping cover crops. What does that mean? What is that practice?
When you go out to the lawn and you mow it with a mower, you're chopping the top of it off. The growing point of the grass is underneath the ground. That's why we can continuously mow the lawn. We're not hurting the growing point. Well, many of the grains have their growing point underground for a good period of their life. So we found that if just mowing it off, some of those crops will regrow by themselves. If we knock it over with a roller and then crimp it, imagine putting a piece of angle iron on the ground and jumping on it. So you're not cutting it off, but you're crimping it, breaking that vascular system. That seems to kill the weeds, kill the cover crop more effectively than mowing it, but it still leaves the residue on the ground. So that's what they mean by crimping it. The roots are still attached to the upper portion, but because you crushed the vascular system, the crop dies.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we will continue with questions at the end, as you mentioned, but in the meantime, Mr. Wrigley.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm Bryce Wrigley. I farm in Delta Junction. We've been there for 38 years. And just like everybody in Delta at the time, the ground was newly cleared, had roots and stuff like that in it. So everybody disked the ground and then they packed it. When we planted our crops initially, we had a disc, we had a packer, we spread fertilizer, we had 2 grain drills. And so it took a number of people to do the planting. And because the ground was black when we were done, I looked like a good seed bed. That's what I'd grown up with all my life. And so when we did that, it was common to see dust blowing around during the field work or after planting. We really depended on spring rains coming timely. So that would be around the end of May. Our journey towards soil health, that's what I was asked to talk about, was how we kind of got where we are. Our journey towards soil health was kind of the story of the decisions that we made and have made to address the management challenges that we had, and also to meet the goals of our farm. One of those challenges that we ran into later on is, as my kids left home, then we wound up short of labor. And as I just described, when we started planting, when we first came, it took about 5 drivers, 5 or 6 pieces of equipment in the field to do our planting. And then there were a number of goals I'll get into here in a minute that we wanted to meet that we were not meeting with that type of planting, call it conventional planting. Anyway, all the decisions we've made on that journey were made for specific reasons. I think anybody interested in cover crop on their farm will wind up considering some or all of them as they move forward. I want to mention the impact that NRCS and their programs had on us. They were probably the key factor in my considering no tillage and cover crops, because NRCS had an incentive program where they would pay you an incentive payment, and I think they still have it. They pay you an incentive payment to try a practice for a few years, and so it gave you an opportunity to mitigate your risk, and that's really the way I saw it. I was willing to do it because the payment for that incentive payment took away part of the risk, because I was sure when I decided to do that, I was absolutely sure that we would see a decrease in yield. And so anyway, that was key to our even beginning with no-till and later with cover crops. So let's see if I could have you go back a slide, I think. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead one more. One more maybe. Okay, so when we decided to start no-tilling, well, go back there's something else I wanted to mention on that. I want you to see this picture. I mentioned the dust that happens when Delta's a windy area, and so the dust picks up off the field, and you can see that picture on the left is very dusty. When we started looking at tillage options, one of the problems we had was cyclical changes in the timing of the spring rains. Ideally, the spring rains would come right at the end of planting, around the end of May, and that would bring the crop evenly. But about every 10 years, we'd go through about a 10-year cycle, and then the spring rains would be delayed. They wouldn't come until a 3rd or 4th week, sometimes in June. And when that happened, we got uneven emergence. And then when the rains came, the rest of the grain that had not germinated, because sitting in dry ground, would germinate. And then at harvest, you had 2 different ages of crop. So it made it very difficult and problematic to harvest. So we went from a traditional tillage with a disc to a chisel plow, and then finally to a no-till drill. I recognize that no tillage is not suitable for all crops, but wherever it can be used, I believe that it maximizes the soil health benefits. Nature does not like bare ground, and no tilling allows that ground to remain armored or covered. Before purchasing our no-till drill, I attended a no-tillage conference in Eastern Washington. And there was one farm we went to, I'll never forget, it was so impressive. They'd been no-tilling for 40 years. And this was up in the Palouse area. And so the hills over years had, all of the topsoil had washed off the hills. The tops of the hills in pictures were actually white because all the topsoil was gone and wouldn't raise a crop. Well, John Aishelman, where we were, recognized this and decided to start no-tilling, see if he could recover some of that capacity on those hilltops. And so after 40 years, it just resulted in a remarkable change. And when we pulled up on the bus, we were up on top of one of these hills, and they had 3 days of rain. And they must have had, I think he said 6 inches of rain in the last 3 days. So you can imagine how wet that would have made it. And they had a demonstration set up that had been calculated by the university to apply, I believe it was 3-inch rainfall onto a designated area. And what they did, they just fired up the pump on a tank, and they stuck this hose up in the air and kind of moved it back and forth. They had a marked area, and they would put all that water for so many seconds or so many minutes, sprinkle it or spray it on that soil. And so they just started it up and ran it for however many minutes. I think it was 3 minutes or something like that, and put the equivalent of a 3-inch rainfall on that area. Now, this was after getting 3 inches or 6 inches of rain in the last 3 days. And it had stopped raining just that morning. So you can imagine you would have expected water to be running down the hill on this slope. And there was nothing. I mean, you could see the water would build up and then it would start running toward the edge of the marked area. And by the time it got to the edge of the marked area, it had soaked into the ground. Well, one of the guys in our area, in our tour, he just took his arm and just stuck it in the soil and started wiggling it down into the soil to see how deep he could go. And it was amazing. He just wiggled his hand and pushed it down in there, got up to his elbow, and then he stopped because he didn't want to get his shirt muddy. And that's how deep and how soft that ground was, but it was still absorbing that water. And that had not been tilled. It was all just no-till. When you stepped off the bus and you stepped on it, it was like walking on a sponge. It was just spongy. Anyway, never forgot that. And so after that experience at that no-till conference, I decided to get a no-till drill. We got one the next year. The very first year we no-tilled, showed me the value of no-tillage. It was one of those times where we got delayed rains. So part of the field, one field of the farm we planted conventionally. The rest of the fields we planted no-till. And we didn't get any rain. In about the 3rd week of June, still had not got any rain. I went out, checked the fields, and the first field we'd planted, the one that was conventionally planted, had grain coming up. It's kind of spotty, single spears showing up, and it just really looked kind of rough. I dug down in one empty spot, one empty patch, just to see if there was grain there, seed there, or if it had missed it for some reason, because like I say, it wasn't coming up. And as I dug down, I found the seed. It was about 1 inch below the surface of the soil. I kept digging, and the moisture level in the soil was about 1.5 inches lower than that. So it was just sitting there waiting for rain. It couldn't germinate without rain. So I went over to the next field, which was one we had planted with the no-till drill. Same day, same amount of seed, same fertilizer mix, same everything. Went there, you could see down the rows, it was even. It was coming up really even and good. And so I thought, well, how dry is this soil? So there was a lot of residue on it. We planted it right into grass. And so I just took my finger and just flicked the cover off. I didn't even dig into the ground, just flicked the cover off, and the soil was moist there. And this was after no rain at all. The soil moisture was still right there underneath the surface of that residue. So since then, we've never worried about whether we got rains in a timely manner or not. Never even worried. We had even drilled a well to irrigate the crop up because it was such a pain trying to harvest grain that was partially ripe and partially dry. Never turned a well on after that. So anyway, and also the other thing is I noticed that there was never any dust blowing off the field. So here, this picture, you can see the dust that we used to see when we would till the fields. And then the right-hand side picture, that's what the field looks like when we no-till it. And there's tons of cover on there. And if you take your hands and just move your fingers through that grass, that ground will be moist right underneath that residue. So next picture. So one thing kind of leads to another. The no-tillage, I guess the best way for me to describe that is when we started into no-till and I saw what was happening, it really resulted in just a change of my mindset about farming itself. I saw farming then as a system and not as a series of separate tasks. Generally you go out, you plant, you harvest, you bale the straw, you're ready, you plant. And so you're doing these things because that's the timely nature of things. And I never did really have any thought about anything other than those tasks that need to be done on time. But I began to recognize that farming was a system, and that by controlling the moisture, by controlling the seed depth and rate and the fertilizer placement and all of those, by making sure that that was controlled perfectly and completely the same every year, we began to see that we could then focus on other things. And so, first of all, we're not losing dust. We're not seeing erosion from rain. We're conserving moisture. We're building soil structure because we're not turning it over and aerating it. And we're preserving a carbon source, which is the feed that those microbes use. And so when you begin to see that the actions you take on some aspect of farming impact a lot of other things, then that's what caused me to start thinking about this as a system. So after observing the effect on the soil, I wanted to know what else I could do. I mean, just one thing led to another. Gosh, this looks great. I wonder what else I can do to help my soil, to make it better. And I came from Idaho, southern Idaho, about 38 years ago. And a portion of our farm was dry farm. And we used to plant every other year, planted barley. We would get about 40 bushel the acre. We never put any fertilizer in. For generations, we never put any fertilizer on those fields. We got about 40 bushel the acre. We got about the same amount of rain down there on the dry farm as what we get in Delta. And yet in Delta, we're getting 40 bushel the acre. I'm planting it every other year, but it's costing me $100 an acre in fertilizer. And so I started thinking, what else can I do? Is there a way of improving the fertility of the soil so that I can reduce my inputs? And so I was reading about cover crops and how they could improve soil fertility over time, and wondered maybe that could reduce the cost of fertilizing. And so we decided to go to plant some cover crops. So you want to turn to the next slide there. So this list is the list of cover crops we planted the very first year. I didn't have any information on what to plant for cover crops. I reached out to a company called Green Cover Seed in Nebraska for a recommendation. Just like Jeff said, there's no data on what grows up here for cover crops. And so they said, well, I don't know, this is the stuff we use down here. Well, NRCS recommends warm and cool season varieties of grasses, broadleaf, brassicas, and legumes in a mix. And so I wanted to put all of those in there because this is another one of those incentive payments with NRCS that I said, I don't know if this is going to work or not, but here's a way of reducing the risk. And so I needed to follow that recommendation. We decided to plant only annual crops as cover crops so that they would winter kill. We were careful to not plant anything that might become an invasive plant. In fact, I had them remove some white clover, white sweet clover, because I didn't want that in there. We replaced that with something else. And we planted our first cover crop with this mix. And it emerged, but it seemed to stall about 4 inches high. It just didn't seem to grow for a couple of weeks. I never noticed anything. So I put a little bit of fertilizer on. I put the least amount that I could get the fertilizer spreader to go to, which was a 12-15-00. So 12 units of nitrogen, 15 units of phosphate. And I just wanted to see if that made a difference. So I sprinkled that on half of the field so that I could tell if it made a difference or not. And sure enough, within a couple of weeks, you could see the difference, and you could see that difference for the rest of the year. Even after the crop grew out of the stall period, it never did catch quite up with what we had put a little bit of fertilizer. So now when we plant cover crops, we apply a starter fertilizer, that minimal amount of fertilizer, we put it on at the time we plant. And then this list that you're seeing there, I just took that out in the field, me and Megan Laney from our district, and we keyed those plants out to see which ones had grown. And I just had this little code here. If there was a plus on it, it means it grew well. If there was a minus on it, it grew, but it didn't mature. And if there was a 0 on it, it was pretty sparse. The ones that were blank were crops that I couldn't find in my scouting. There might have been some out there, but I didn't find any while we were scouting. And so I used that to refine that list, and then we made some changes for the next year. I learned a lot about this the first time. One of the most basic things was I was surprised at the variety of crops that could be grown as cover crops. They didn't have to mature to benefit the soil. And so I didn't worry too much about maturation. More, I just worried would they get up to a reasonable height, you know, and when or a reasonable size. The NRCS incentive payment was enough to pay for the seed, and it paid for part of the shipping. So that was the risk that I was able to avoid to try these things out. So go to the next slide now. So this list is the one that we have used basically since 2019, the last few years. High residue crops, which we plant for, and that is we're planting cover crops, and we want to balance the carbon nitrogen ratio to those cereal crops. So the cereal crops are a high residue crop, and so we need nitrogen to make sure that there's enough nitrogen to break down a crop and provide food for those for the microbes and not have them run out. And and then every year for the last couple of years, we've done our district has done a soil health field day, and we've done it on my farm. And last year, 2021, Jody Anderson was there, and she suggested that since we were raising grain, we're balancing for carbon, we could probably reduce the grasses in our mix. You see that mix right there. It has spring triticale and oats, 7 pounds each. And so I visited with NRCS, and we reduced the amount of grasses that we planted. But we still maintained the warm and the cool season grass in our mix, just a lower amount. Most of the covers that we plant would not be grown as a primary crop, but they can still compete with weeds. They can pull up nutrients from the root zone or into the root zone. They can create channels in the soil for water. They can fix nitrogen. They can help balance your carbon and nitrogen ratio. So we're still using those cover crops for those things. One of the, if you're going to go to the next slide now. The cover crops are new to Alaska, and most of them perform differently in America. Not only that, we use them differently. In America, they plant after they harvest most of the time, and they'll harvest a bean crop, a corn crop, whatever they're harvesting, wheat, and they've got a long enough season before winter that they'll plant a cover crop and keep that ground covered, and then they'll terminate that crop before they put the next crop in, or shortly after they put the next crop in. But in Alaska, we don't have that kind of time. And so what we've been doing on our farm is we had a barley fallow rotation. And so now what we're doing is barley, and then we're on the year that we were fallow, that's when we plant the cover crops. So we've got a barley cover crop rotation. And my hope is that over time, with that rotation, we'll improve the soil, make it more fertile, better able to raise a crop, and hopefully save some fertilizer expense, especially when fertilizer's 40% higher this year than it's been. So it's a humongous burden. Anyway, NRCS, Jeff mentioned the NRCS fallow or cover crop funded study. And so we had that study on our farm. This is a picture of the cover crops from our farm, 23 species, 4 replications each. We collected data this year. We'll do it again next year. Trial will be repeated. And then all that data will be analyzed so that as NRCS makes cover crop recommendations, they've got more knowledge about what recommendations to make. This is a really important effort because there is seriously a lack of knowledge about cover crop species and their performance in Alaska. We really need that. So change to the next slide. The next steps for us, there's some things that we want to still do. I mean, you never stop. So we're looking at termination dates. I mentioned that we plant annual crops so that we could just plan on winter terminating them. And some of those crops were seeded and headed out and mature. Others were not. But I'm wondering maybe a termination date earlier than that is good. I think that there would benefit some in terms of weed control by being able to do that earlier. And there's just a lot of questions that we still don't know. So we're trying to figure those things out. But that's the next thing. One of the next things is to find the best termination date. Don't know if we do that and terminate that earlier. Don't know if that will be an advantage. Don't know if it'll save any moisture. Don't know if earlier termination will let us do a better job of weed control. I think that it will. Is there an advantage to rolling over mowing or over herbicide? Does earlier termination impact microbial activity differently than winter termination? So just a lot of questions. Last year, we planted some pollinator habitat. The cover crops are amazing for pollinator, but it's another one of those things, you start with no-till and then you want to do something more. So you do some cover crops and then you think, wow, this is exciting. I want to do something else. And so this year or this last year, we put in some pollinator habitat. And the thing is that's good for more than just pollinators. It's also used to benefit or to attract beneficial insects, which control the pests. And so that's really important that pest predator balance becomes stable. I was talking to somebody today and they mentioned that they they plant soybeans in cordon rotation. And they said, yeah, we had some bad slug infestations on some of the beans when we plant beans after cover crops. But he said they used to be, they plant 50, 60 acres a year. I have to replant it due to slug problems. And I thought it was interesting. And then he said, the last 4 years hasn't had to have anything. And what happens is as you persist in this cover crop regimen, then it brings that pest predator balance into play. And so if you just be patient and give it some time, that's what we found on our farm. Be patient, give it some time, then those pests and predators will balance each other out. And he said there's still slugs out there. You can dig around, you can find them, but they're not a problem in the crop because while they do some damage, the predators control them, keep them at a level where they're not a big problem. And so that's what we've seen on our farm too. Let's see. One other thing I want to try and do this year is with the high price of fertilizer, I really am seriously, I decided I'm going to try planting about 10 acres or so with, I'll plant barley in it. And then I'll interseed or companion plant some clover because I want to see if I plant the barley without any nitrogen, can I get nitrogen out of the clover to help pay for that? We'll see. I'm not interested in getting the most yield, the highest yield in the area. I'm interested in getting a good positive cash flow. So if I get a lower yield, but I have less input, that's what I'm interested in. What's that margin? How much black money can I put in my pocket? And so, yeah, if that means that I don't have the highest yield, I'm fine with that. So the next slide, please. So everybody's going to have to decide our cover crops for me. And one of the things you'll have to do is decide how can you offset the cost? Does it make money? Does it save money? What's the value to that socially? We live in an area or a time when social values have taken have a cost. If you're not socially responsible, some people won't buy your stuff. If you are socially responsible, some people buy it because you're socially responsible. What goals do you have? You've got erosion. Do you want to improve your soil structure? You have a weed problem. Do you want more biological diversity? All these things are good goals. You got to decide what your goals are so that you can plant the right cover crops. Eventually, everybody is going to ask whether you can justify paying for the cover crops in the long term. While NRCS's program is available, it'll get you started. It'll give you a try. But if you decide you want to keep doing it, that money runs out and you got to decide, okay, can I afford to do this? And so what's the value of that. A lot of factors play into that decision, but in some way, the value of the cover crops has to offset that cost. Some of those values are easy to quantify. Others are more intangible, but they're still valuable. But the combination of all of them has to justify the cost, and that's not necessarily cheap. So next slide. So this budget is not meant to be complete. It's just a visual representation. I just want you to see that you do have a cost there that you have to offset. And so for the seed mix that we plant is about $40 an acre. The starter fertilizer is $20 an acre. So we got $60 an acre into cover crops when we plant, and we do not harvest that. So that's $60 an acre basically are pouring down the drain. But what are the values to that? Okay, if you've got cows or got some feed value out of that cover crop, then you've covered that. We had 1 year, 2 years ago, we allowed a farmer who has cattle. He was short of feed. He said, can I harvest your cover crops, bale them up? I said, sure. So he baled them off. He got nearly 200 bales off of 100 acres, so 2 bales the acre. He said that he gave me the prices, the values of his bales that he felt like, and cattle do really, really well on cover crops. I mean, they'll do absolutely fabulous. They put on gains so fast. But anyway, so that $230 per acre in feed value, those are his numbers. I didn't come up with those. I asked him, so what's the value of that? He said $230 an acre is what the value of that was to him. If we can get to the point where we're saving a little bit of fertilizer, then it's $20 maybe, an acre, then that's some savings. What's the social value? There's that's one of those things that's how do you quantify what the social? Are there people who are buying our Alaska Flower Company products because of the way we farm that maybe wouldn't otherwise buy them? And so there's a value of, I feel pretty comfortable in saying, yeah, there's at least $30 an acre worth of people buying our products because we're farming responsibly, we're trying to do it sustainably, we're trying to do it in a regenerative fashion. And so like I say, some of those values are easy to calculate. And if you're feeding livestock, it's a slam dunk. You've got it covered. If you're not feeding livestock, then say you're only saving $20 an acre in fertilizer and $30 an acre in social value, social cost. That's $50. You still got to come up with $10. But is $10 an acre worth having your soil not blow away, not wash away, having more biodiversity in there, having healthier soil, better structure, allowing the water to percolate down through into the root zone? Is that $10 worth that? And in my opinion, I think it is. It can take a lot of years to significantly improve the soil nutrient profile enough to reduce fertilizer. But as it improves, I think that we'll see that be able to be factored in, and I'll be able to zero in on that. But for the time being, I'm committed to continuing the cover crops. I've seen the benefit. I think that the long-term benefit will be even greater than the short-term benefit. So let's see. Is there something else on that? Again, the NRCS benefits got us started in that. As they run out, you have to decide where the value is. For me, although most of the value is not quantifiable at this point, I'm still working to quantify those values. I'm comfortable enough in that to commit to continuing to plant cover crops. I like what's happening under there. I like the diversity of not just in the soil, but even just the insects and stuff I see. You walk out in the cover crop field and the bees are flying around, the flies are flying around. You walk into a barley field, you don't hear or see any of that. And so I love seeing that. So go to the next slide there. For me, the no tillage and the cover crops have been really rewarding. I'm sure that the soil is improving. I see a lot better soil moisture, virtually no soil loss from the wind. Rain soaks in better. I think that the time will come when we'll see some fertilizer, save some fertilizer, but the biggest driver for me is just knowing that overall we're using the best practices we possibly can for our farm. And every year in summertime, we do regular tours throughout the summer, and we talk about what we do on our farm and how we try and improve the soil health and sustainability. And I just want to throw out an invitation. All of you guys are welcome to come and attend. We'll be putting out the tour registration. Started up again probably in May, so that we can start the tours in June. I would like to get the crops up so people can see something growing. But you're welcome to attend, register for a tour on our website, lastflowercompany.com. And thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Bryce. And after being someone who has attended one of your tours, I can say it's well worth it. So people should definitely sign up and attend. So let's see, we do have some questions. Let's see here. Is there an annual cover crop I can sprinkle by a veg patch that will outcompete, the bird veg here in Fairbanks, and after a couple years get rid of the veg? We did have Gino talking about invasive weeds not long ago, but do Jeff, you or Bryce have any thoughts on that?
That's just pretty tough. I'm not sure I can come up with anything that's more competitive than an established vetch plot.
Yeah, we do have, I can probably drop in some information too about that. Go ahead, Bryce, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, if you've got an established veg patch, I mean, you could spend the rest of your life doing a weed pull, or you could spray it with some herbicide and kill it after a few years. You're going to have a seed bank to work through as well. And after the first couple of years, then that should begin declining, but it'll take some time to work through that.
Yeah, and at Cooperative Extension, we do have publications. I posted a few of those if folks attended, but we'll have those on our website. We have, different mitigation options for lots of different invasive plants. So yeah, true story. What is the difference between high and low residue crops?
So for what I consider a high residue crop is one that has a lot of straw, so barley, oats, small grains. Low residue crop would be something that when, so the easy way to look at it is what is left on the field after going through the winter time. If you got vegetables and you go back out there after the winter time, after snow leaves, and it's hard to find anything there, maybe just a few leaves once in a while and they're all dried out. That's a low residue crop in my mind, as opposed to something like grain that takes a lot more time to break down. You got stubble there, you got grain on the ground, straw on the ground, not grain, straw on the ground. And it takes a while to break that down. So that's what grass would be, another high residue crop, something with a stem that doesn't just decompose, just doesn't rot away in a season. That's what I consider a high residue crop and need to balance for. Jeff might have a better technical.
I know Bryce said it very, very well. In those plots where we had 10 different cover crops trying to get residue, anything of the brassicas was not identifiable in the spring. It had just, the complete vegetation had broken down over the winter, but all of the small grains, they were still intact straw on the ground. So it's kind of how much lignin is in the cover crop and how long it lasts through the winter.
Gotcha. Some kudos to you, Bryce, for your product and leaving a legacy. People appreciate that and your sustainable ag approaches. So which clover is recommended? Is red annual okay, but perennial is not? So what are some thoughts there? And then there's white, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong. Felicia, is that right? I'm going to probably, Jeff, you have to correct me on that one. Facilia, okay. What are your thoughts on that?
Facilia is another word for it is bee flower. And I really only put the Facilia in because it kind of came in with the first mix and I saw how much the bees enjoyed it. So I've just kept it in. I don't know if there's particularly an agronomic benefit to it. There might be, but I don't know. Oh, what was the first part of that question?
Clover recommend is
Oh, yeah,
red.
clover.
Yeah,
Oh.
it's so annual or perennial, okay or not. It was to kind of,
Some clovers can be invasive up here. The white sweet clover, yellow sweet clover, I stay away from. We had it removed from our initial recommendation because I didn't know if it would become invasive, and I didn't know if it was a different kind than the white sweet clover we have up here. I just didn't want to take a chance. But I do use crimson clover in mine. Crimson clover is a short clover, and that's worked well. So I don't know about red clover. I think that red clover would probably grow fine. The trials show that.
in that vein, there was another question about, are there other farmers in the Delta area participating in cover crop trials as well?
Not cover crop trials. We have some farmers who are using cover crops in their rotation for their cattle. They'll plant, maybe some of them planted some of the berm row areas to cover crops, and then they'll turn the cows into it for a few days and then take them out and then let them come back. And they'll maybe do that 2 or 3 times during the summertime. Get phenomenal growth on the cover crops. And then we've got other people who are using some form of cover crop in their grain production. I think we're the only ones using, other than the ones that are using cover crops for livestock feed. I think we're the only ones that are using multiple species. Some of them are using oats. Some might be using ryegrass. We haven't used any ryegrass yet. I know it's a very popular one in America, but we haven't used it because, well, we're already balancing for straw, and so just put another grass in there. If there was another reason, like maybe some erosion problems or something like that, ryegrass might be a super good idea, or filtration might be a really good option there, but we don't have that problem.
So you're the only trial site in Delta, right? That's
For the cover crop trial with the NRCS cover crop trials, yes, we are. Our farm is the site that the district is using.
Gotcha. Here was a question, kind of comment about one of your pictures. Are you using moose to fertilize? Any other animals? Any other animals you can use that you can use to increase fertility? Hunting opportunities?
Yeah. So I should have probably mentioned that I said that if you are feeding livestock, then there's an easy quantification tool there for paying for your cover crops. And unfortunately, we don't have any livestock. So, but I did take a picture of the moose. There was one year we had, well, there were some hunters out there. They were looking for bison, but they counted 100 moose on that one field, 100-acre field, and they stopped counting at 100. They stopped counting at 100.
Wow.
So I went out there and I took a picture. It was starting to get dark, and I could only get part of the field. So those moose were out there in herds. But one option for me would be that I've explored a little bit is maybe to find somebody that's got some livestock and they're looking for some grazing ground. We can make a deal where they could graze my cover crops. The thing about grazing cover crops is you get the value of the cover crops, the feed value that gives you gain to the cattle, but you also get the poop. And that's what I didn't get when I let the farmer bale that off, is that, so he took that and they took it off, and I didn't get any poop back. I didn't get any benefit to the cover crop beyond what was underneath the soil surface. So, and it was worth something, but it wasn't a full measure of value. So that was the only time I've done that. But after seeing that, I have thought about maybe using cover crops as actually a rotation crop, and just bale it off and do that every other year, you know, where I'm not planting grain, plant cover crops and bale it and sell it. And I mean, that might be another option. Haven't done the cost benefit analysis on that yet, but that was a thought I had.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the dollar figure on the moose, but that'd be another value add.
Yeah,
to figure total.
If I could sell hunts to that would be great. But I live in an area that's a permanent hunt anyway. So
Yeah, somebody put hunting opportunities. Any idea on how well sorghum and amaranth would do? Amaranth, yes, would do in the interior area between Toke and Glen Allen. Would they be suitable as cover crops?
Between Toke and Glen Allen, yeah, I don't know how they would do in that area in particular. I don't know what the growing season is there, or even what the soil type is.
Maybe Jeff has some thoughts. I don't know.
It's a huge gamble. We grew sorghum in Palmer 2 seasons. One year was warm enough that we got sorghum up to thigh high. The next year was too cool. Sorghum is a very warm season grass. Amaranth is also relatively warm season. So I don't think you'll get it to the point of getting grain out of it.
Gotcha. Yeah, actually, one of our awesome experts, Janice Chumley's with us tonight. And she said for as far as the veg goes, you can sprinkle a heavy cover of carpet or cardboard over the veg as well. So lots of other options for that, how to deal with that situation. How do you think quinoa would do? Okay here, as well as millet. Anyone heard any thoughts on that?
We've grown millet in our cover crop mix. Jeff probably has a lot more information about quinoa. My understanding is that it requires darkness to set seed.
It just scares me. I don't want quinoa anywhere around. It's a very close relative to lamb's quarter. So if lamb's quarter goes to seed and becomes a weed, I don't want quinoa anywhere close to me. So
Interesting.
I don't want to try it. Thank you.
How come I've heard advice to remove, or how come I've heard advice to remove my vegetable garden roots, leaves, etc.? They say it is so you don't carry over pests. It's a small garden around my home, not commercial. So that's, yeah, I don't know. Jeff, do you have any thoughts on that? Maybe it has to do with, yeah, the
Yes,
pest
your
related.
grandparents wanted to keep you busy, so they asked you to do that. There's no biological reason to do it.
That's one of those, huh? Okay.
Yep.
One of those old.
You've got
old
kids that you
stories.
need to assign something to do, so you said pull everything out of the garden, weeds and all. If you truly have disease problems that are so bad that warrant complete removal of all vegetation in the garden, it's time to call a plant pathologist in. But normal circumstances, not at all.
Gotcha. Just to confirm, Bryce, what was the name of the company that you got your mix from? Where are they located?
It was Green Cover Seed in Nebraska.
Okay. Someone confirmed that here, but wasn't sure about location. So which cover crops are suitable for home gardeners? Ones that could be terminated by walking over them as opposed to having to use machinery. What are the cover crops that take the shortest amount of time to grow? Do you know if they're cover crops I could put between, say, sunflowers to keep the soil covered and improve its health? I know, Jeff, do you have some thoughts on that?
I love oats. They're cheap. They grow very well. It's a large seed. So even if you have to disturb the ground, throw some oats on it, run over it quickly with a landscape rake, I guarantee it's going to grow if it has a little bit of moisture. They're foolproof, and of all the different seed, it's relatively cost effective.
Nice. Well, I don't see any other questions. There's a little bit of chat going on about slugs and such in the chat box, a little bit of conversation there. But thank you both very much for all of your expertise, and Tracy, you as well. I think you're still with us. I did share that website for NRCS as well that does a really nice overview of the trials and information around the state. So thank you all so very much. Very informative, and this recording will be available, of course, as well for folks who weren't able to attend this evening. So we'll have that made available. Thanks for the information, and we appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thanks for inviting us.
All right. Have a good evening. We'll see everyone next week.
Bye-bye.
Yep.